It is the 17th of January, 1940, not in the smoking, shell-blasted mud of Europe, but on the silent, humid decks of the Akagi, flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's first air fleet, anchored near Kurai. The air is still, thick with the smell of new paint and diesel oil. The rising sun, already high, casts a brilliant, merciless glare across the steel. Beneath the deck, in a cramped, meticulously ordered cabin, sits a man whose name will be etched in the grim calculus of the Pacific War, Admiral Kiichinaga. He is studying a sheaf of papers, not battle plans, but dry, translated economic reports. His brow is furrowed, not from concern over a tactical deployment, but over an impending, existential imbalance. He is not looking at maps of islands, but at charts detailing the output of steel, oil, and pig iron. The sound that permeates this moment is not the roar of engines, but the crisp, mechanical tick of a simple, American-made office clock, a captured curiosity that sits on his small mahogany desk. It is a gift from a junior officer, a mundane object whose relentless, steady rhythm seems to mock the fierce, but finite pace of his own nation's industry. This moment matters because it is the fragile silence before the hurricane, the rational realization dawning in the mind of the architect of the coming storm. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kido Buti, was designed for the swift, decisive strike. It was a razor, honed to perfection, capable of dealing a death blow in the first, glorious hour of conflict. Its doctrine was rooted in Bushido, in the belief that spiritual purity, unshakable courage, and disciplined self-sacrifice could overcome the coarse, material advantages of the adversary. Japan was betting everything on the short war. Their strategy was simple: paralyze the American fleet at the outset, seize the resource-rich perimeter of the South Pacific, establish an impregnable defense, and force a negotiated peace before the slow, lumbering giant across the ocean could wake up, let alone rise to its full height. What the Japanese soldier, sailor, and airman expected was a relatively quick campaign, a surgical, glorious expansion, followed by a hard-fought but victorious defense of their new co-prosperity sphere. They saw the Americans as soft, decadent, and easily distracted, a nation bloated by easy living, lacking the inner fire necessary for total war. Their early successes, the shocking rout at Pearl Harbor, the capture of Singapore, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, the seemingly unstoppable march across the Philippines, confirmed this deep-seated belief. Japan's warriors believed they were fighting with the gods on their side, imbued with a fighting spirit no mere machine could suppress. The Admiral, however, looked not to the gods, but to the cold figures on the page. His economic intelligence told a terrifyingly different story. He saw the potential of a nation that was not just rich, but was, in its very essence, a vast, complex, self-healing machine capable of continuous, exponential growth. Now, fast forward 2 years to June of 1942, to the crushing, unforeseen defeat at Midway. 4 of the finest carriers of the Kido Butai are burning, the backbone of the fleet broken, the spiritual superiority shattered. This is where the emotional contrast becomes a stark, unforgiving reality. The Japanese aviator, who took off expecting to engage a few surviving, scattered American planes, encountered waves, then more waves, then reserves. The American losses at Pearl Harbor, which should have crippled the fleet for a year, were, in reality, absorbed by a continental industrial sponge. The Japanese had sunk battleships, the relics of a past war. But the Americans responded by accelerating the build rate of the Essex-class aircraft carriers, the absolute future of naval warfare. The shock was not merely losing for carriers. It was the realization that Japan could not replace them for a year, while America had already laid the keels for a dozen more. The expected brief, glorious campaign had morphed into a grueling, material deathmatch on Guadalcanal. The Japanese infantryman, taught that his spiritual will made him superior to all earthly hardship, found himself starving in the jungle. His American counterpart, supplied by an unbroken line of ships stretching back to the factories of California and Detroit, ate 3 meals a day. This contrast was often symbolized by the simplest, most mundane of objects, the American Sirashan can. The Sirashan can was a small, oblong tin, dull olive drab in color, utterly without poetry or spiritual significance. Yet, to the starving Japanese soldier, it was the physical embodiment of the enemy's terrible, mocking strength. A single tin containing processed meat, crackers, and a packet of soluble coffee represented a vast chain of logistics. The oil to fuel the trains, the steel to roll the tin plate, the massive agricultural production to fill it, the colossal canning factories to process it, the Liberty ships to transport it, and the dock workers to unload it. The Japanese soldier, surviving on meager rice balls, often found discarded sarashin, cans hafitan, tossed aside with careless ease, a profound insult. It wasn't just food, it was abundance treated as disposable. It was the recurring sound of the American machine spitting out sustenance as easily as it spat out bullets. The historical evidence begins to pile up, cold, brutal, and unanswerable. In the years 1940 and 1941, the United States produced roughly 4.5 million tons of steel per month. Japan, for the entirety of 1941, scraped together barely 7 million tons total. This initial gulf in material was then weaponized by American ingenuity and an almost unimaginable organizational effort. Consider the Liberty ship program. This was not merely shipbuilding, it was a revolution in assembly line construction, transforming naval architecture into industrial mass production. Led by Henry Kaiser, the yards at Richmond, California, and others became factories that happened to float. The Japanese, with their exquisite, handcrafted destroyers and carefully constructed battleships, took years to build a single heavy vessel. The Americans, in the span of 1 year, 1942, launched 544 Liberty ships. The Japanese sank ships, and for every vessel they consigned to the deep, the American yards spat out 2, then 3, then 4 more. By the war's end, over 2,700 Liberty ships had been launched. The vast majority of these were ugly, slow, and crudely welded. They were the antithesis of the aesthetically perfect Japanese warship, but they carried the weight of a continent's worth of food, fuel, and fire. The sound of the massive, clanging assembly line in the Kaiser yards was the deafening reply to the bombs dropped on Pearl Harbor. In the air, the numerical superiority became a physical, tangible terror. In 1941, Japan produced 5,000 aircraft. In 1942, the US produced 47,000. By 1944, when the great aerial battles were reaching their climax, the numbers ceased to be comparable. Japan struggled to maintain 16,000 planes, while the United States delivered an astonishing 96,000 aircraft, almost 100,000 new high-performance fighters and bombers in a single calendar year. The famed Mitsubishi Zero, initially feared for its agility and range, was handcrafted, its parts often incompatible between different factory floors. It was a fighter born of elegance and scarcity. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the plane that ultimately swept the Zero from the skies, was designed for ease of manufacture, durability, and a forgiving flight envelope. It was a machine designed for the production line, built by people who had been making refrigerators and washing machines 6 months prior. When American pilots were shot down, they were often rescued and back in the fight within days. When a Japanese pilot was lost, he was irreplaceable, and the planes he flew were irreplaceable. The Japanese imperial staff had understood, intellectually, that America was an industrial powerhouse, but they could not grasp the speed and scale of its mobilization. They believed that democratic bureaucracy and political infighting would slow the process. They failed to account for the unique ability of a free, capitalist economy, once truly threatened, to pivot and dedicate its entire output to a single, overriding objective. They did not account for the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. This colossal factory, built by Henry Ford, was designed not just to build bombers, but to build them faster than the enemy could shoot them down. At its peak, the Willow Run plant delivered a massive B-2 for Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. A single factory was producing more four-engine-heavy bombers than the entire Japanese Empire was producing combat aircraft. Total. This fact alone, the sheer indifferent volume of production, was an absolute refutation of the concept of spiritual victory. The psychological impact of this material flood was devastating. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, the Japanese defenders witnessed the American pre-invasion bombardments. The naval guns fired not in measured salvos, but in a continuous, deafening deluge that lasted for days, turning coral into powder and jungle into splinters. When the Americans landed, they brought ashore not just rifles, but bulldozers. tractors, massive quantities of gasoline, prefabricated hospitals, and always the endless supply of ration cans. This is the context that brings us back to the Admiral, or to the collective, desperate wisdom of the highest imperial command, late in 1944. The diary of Admiral Meto Mugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, and a man of sober, meticulous observation, captures this realization in his final entries. The words, while slightly varied in translation, carried the same chilling truth. We fought with spirit, but they fought with logistics. Our greatest fault was the failure to comprehend their potential for output. We misjudged the true size of the American arsenal. We cannot win against American industry. The transformation was absolute. The initial ideology of the swift, glorious decisive battle was abandoned, replaced by the grim doctrine of attrition and endurance. The strategic objective changed from defeating the American fleet to making the cost of victory so high that the American public would abandon the war. The shift was from the elegance of the zero to the raw, terrifying fanaticism of the kamikaze, the ultimate, desperate expenditure of the only resource Japan could still produce in abundance: young men willing to die. It was the final, tragic admission that the material war was lost, and only the spiritual weapon of self-annihilation remained. The recurring symbol, the ubiquitous ration can, followed the American advance across the Pacific. It was found on every beachhead, every foxhole, and every liberated airfield. It was the physical manifestation of a supply chain that never broke, never paused, and never went dry. When American forces captured an area, they immediately began constructing infrastructure: roads, airstrips, supply dumps. The Japanese, conversely, spent their days meticulously conserving dwindling ammunition and searching for roots and rats to eat. In the heat of battle, a Japanese sniper might have his last few rounds for his rifle, while the American soldier had a belt full of cartridges and, within arm's reach, another freshly opened, half-finished can of processed ham and lima beans. The contrast was not just in firepower, it was in the fundamental, underlying confidence that the American supply system engendered the confidence of endless backup, endless fuel, and endless food. The tin can, stamped by a machine in Chicago or New York, became more than just a container. It was the symbol of a nation's priorities. It demonstrated that the American system was built to provide for its citizens, even on the furthest front lines, with a security that went beyond the immediate battlefield. It was a promise: you will not starve, you will not run out of bullets, you will be replaced and resupplied. This promise, baked into the simple, sealed tin, was the ultimate material expression of the freedom and abundance the Allied nations were fighting to preserve. The war's final, devastating acts, the firebombing, and the ultimate use of the atomic weapon, were themselves the terrifying, ultimate application of this industrial capacity, the harnessing of an entire continent's scientific and production resources for a single, overwhelming blow. The Admiral's final cold assessment, written down in the fading hours of the conflict, was not a lament about tactics or courage, but a stark, mathematical truth about ideologies. It confirmed that the spiritual will of a disciplined, militaristic state, however fierce, could not overcome the material, creative, and logistical power of a democracy fighting on its own. Industrial terms. The ultimate tragedy for Imperial Japan was that they forced a material war upon an industrial nation without measuring the true cost of that challenge. They mistook comfort for weakness, and they misjudged the immense, latent power that lay dormant in a system built on individual liberty and economic freedom. Freedom, it turns out, is not just a philosophical concept. It is the engine that allows a machinist in Detroit to decide on a better way to assemble a wing flap, an engineer in New York to find a cheaper way to weld a hull, and a farmer in Iowa to produce a surplus vast enough to fill thousands of ration cans. The Admiral's entry, scrawled in the closing moments of his war, remains a poetic reflection on the terrible arithmetic of conflict. Material abundance, when mobilized by free will, is the true armor of nations. The Japanese Empire was crushed not merely by bombs and bullets, but by the relentless humming, inexorable sound of the American factory, a sound that never stopped, a beat that simply overwhelmed the drum of the warrior's heart. It is the lasting, chilling truth of the Pacific War. The war was lost, not on the seas around Midway, but on the economic charts studied by an anxious admiral long before the first shot was fired.